The following is a segment from the book I published called The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science. I am currently slowly working on recording an audiobook version of this, read by myself, which may or may not be ready in time for the holidays. If you enjoy this segment, please consider buying a copy for yourself or a friend this holiday season. Link is listed below. Part 2. Taoism after Lao-tzu. A frog in a well cannot discuss the ocean because he is limited by the size of his well. A summer insect cannot discuss ice because it knows only its own season. A narrow-minded scholar cannot discuss the Tao because he is constrained by his teachings. Now you have to come out of your banks and see the great ocean. You now know your own inferiority, so it is now possible to discuss the great principles with you. Chuang-tzu. Chuang-tzu. Lao-tzu's supposed successor, Chuang-tzu, or Chuang-tzu, allegedly wrote the second most important book to the Taoists, the Chuang-tzu, a much longer book written with wit, irreverence, and spontaneousness, and is considered one of the most influential works of literature in Chinese history. It is a book made to force you to think beyond what you know. One example from the book is The Dream of the Butterfly, in which he dreams he is a butterfly, and then when Chuang-tzu wakes up, he questions whether he was a man dreaming he was a butterfly, or he is actually a butterfly currently dreaming he is a man. Uncertainty is the center of his book, because the second you become certain of anything, your mind stops questioning, and you can easily get stuck in an untruth. It is because of this that it has been said that science is not completely certain of anything. It is, however, agnostic with degrees of certainty. The more data and better the methods of weeding out statistical anomalies and personal bias that science develops, the more certain one can be. However, one can never be 100% certain of anything, which is why scientists so often use words like might be, possibly, probably, and never is. Even though the chances of them being wrong is microscopic on some topics, they still refuse to use terms that describe it with full certainty. To the layperson, facts are hard and solid things, quantified nuggets of never-changing truth. While growing up, I collected facts. I unfortunately had no idea how many qualifiers these facts actually had, and how often they only worked in certain situations. I really enjoyed chemistry, but I didn't realize that I was given a fake shell of an understanding to start out with. It's all way more complex than what they teach you, and takes years of learning to fully grasp. I treated every rule of first-year high school chemistry like it was a solid certain fact. I would run stoichiometric calculations in hopes of figuring out how to make new chemical compounds. For those who don't know, stoichiometry is a way to calculate the beginning and ending products of a chemical reaction. I would experiment with legally attainable chemicals and rarely get the results I wanted or expected, and energy input, bond shape, and catalyzation had yet to be taught to me. I did the same thing with string theory. I took all pop science facts I knew about string theory and used some brilliant and innovative thinking and created my own theory to explain it. Had all the facts been solid and correct, and as simple as I thought they were, I may even then have not been right. I would have had to find a way to disprove it in the real world, and I didn't have the first clue how or even why to do this. I hung on to the idea in the back of my mind until about 15 years later when I picked up a book by Brian Greene and discovered all the facts I thought I knew about quantum physics were true but not solid, and there was an entire universe of what I was oblivious to in science and how and why we know what we know. Useless is just as important as usefulness. Hui Shi of the School of Names told Master Chuang, "All of your teachings are centered around what is of no use." The master replied, "It's only when you appreciate what has no use that you can begin to talk about what has use. Man uses only a little space at any one time. If you were to remove the space he isn't using, how long would he be able to use the space he is using?" Hui Shi replied, "It would cease to serve any purpose. That is why we must understand the things that are considered to have no use. The useless is incredibly important in science. The useless is free, but still useless. The space in our house can't be bought or sold, but is there anyway. Play is useless, but it's found to be essential to build a creative, healthy, and productive mind. To subsistence farmers who were relying on crops just to survive, education was useless compared to working hard to grow crops. But once education became common, more were able to create farming techniques and implements which allowed one to work less to produce more. In fact, invention and tinkering is useless. Most of what you're going to make will end up useless and often in the trash. But by making enough useless things, you can end up making something very useful. Meditation is useless. You're doing literally nothing, not even thinking about problem solving. Yet because of it, you can recharge and have useful thoughts that are more healthy and productive. You could be using that time to work, but you will burn yourself out and make more mistakes. Enjoyment is useless. Happiness is useless. Yet it still makes life worth living. In the book Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio, a man had his brain damaged in the area that produces emotion, making him all logic and brilliant, but because he had no emotion, he had not even the slightest bit of motivation to do anything without logic. In science, studying the useless is essential. The breeding habits of a rare moth may be useless now, but in the future, all of that time and research may lead to a new discovery in medicine or even biomimicry, and it will turn out that that research was needed. Air was considered useless, but when people began studying it, they realized they could make it useful. People believed that there was nothing in a vacuum, but it turns out a Higgs field is there, which gives everything mass. In a parable, Chuang-tzu said that a man had a donkey, and he was traveling on a pilgrimage to a holy place. He was very poor and very hungry, having spent his last coin. So he sold his donkey to another traveler who was rich. But the next afternoon the sun was very hot, and the poor man rested in the shadow of the donkey. The new owner was frustrated and said, "You sold this donkey to me. Get away from him." The old owner replied, "I have sold you the donkey, but not his shadow." Things taken for granted and useless can become useful under the right circumstances. Silence is useless to most people, while talking is useful. But for some, talking just to talk is useless, and getting to the meat of the topic is useful. From a psychologist's viewpoint, small talk generates connections that can be useful in terms of bonding. In the world of science, nothing is useless. Everything in science is useful. It serves a purpose and is essential. It is purely a subjective value placed on our minds that makes things useless. Respect is not useful to Chuang-tzu, but it is to the average person. Chuang-tzu spoke of a man with a hunchback. The emperor had a war and forced all young men into the military. However, he was useless to the military. If you are useless, no one can control you. You can be left alone. You are free. He said, "Be alert and don't be very useful, or people will exploit you." A tree that is all knotty and scraggly is useless to a person looking for wood to build with, and they will leave it alone. But for a person looking for firewood, that tree is very useful. Make sure you are only useful to the right people in ways they need. As science progresses, what is useless exists less and less. In the modern era, in a forceful draft like that, the hunchback could still have use for his mental faculties thanks to modern technology. In the modern era, all of his arguments are paradoxes, and may have been his point then, to be a foil to legalism and flip the script just to get people to think beyond the rigid structures society had placed on usefulness and ego. In a village where Master Chuang was passing through, the entire village was laughing at him. This is because the teacher was riding backwards on his donkey, talking to his disciples. This, in feudal China, where appearances were everything, and doing the slightest silly-looking thing could damage your honor, this sort of thing was not done. The disciples were very embarrassed and distracted because they were seen with the silly man who seemed to care nothing about honor. Finally, one asked, "Why are you doing this? You're making a fool of yourself and by proxy us too. We're being ridiculed unnecessarily. People think we're idiots." Master Chuang replied, "There is something great implied in that. If I sit the way one would normally sit on the donkey, my back is facing you, and that is insulting to you. And I don't want to insult anyone, not even you. If you walk in front of me, you will have to have your back to me, and that is insulting to me, and it's not good for disciples to be seen disrespecting their masters. You could walk backwards in front of me, but that is dangerous, and I don't want you to come to harm. We could also stop, but we must move forward. So this is the solution I have found, and I can still teach even when we are moving. Let the fools laugh. We are facing each other. I am being respectful of you, and you are being respectful of me. and the donkey has no objections, so why should we care at all what the others think? Useless does not mean meaningless. Depression is a lot of work without useful results. In fact, one of the things one always wants to do when depressed is to try and think their way out of the depressive episode. Depression is exhausting without accomplishing anything. One of the best ways to deal with depression, aside from getting psychological help, is to do the useless thing of not thinking. You get tired and aching when you are sick. Quite often, the virus or bacteria isn't causing that. Your own body is doing that to get you to rest and stop moving. Your brain turns the natural background aches you already have up to 11, and it forces you to lay down and stop moving. Your immune system then uses that energy you are no longer using to fight the infection. The same is true with your brain during depression. The brain has natural mechanisms to get one out of depression. Some are more resilient and some are less, which then requires medication. The best way to stop a depressive episode is the same way you fight a sickness. Conserve energy and become useless. Your brain has a limited amount of glucose that can be brought into the brain and limited amount of waste product that can leave the brain. When thinking and focusing on your depression, you won't get enough glucose to the right areas of your brain needed to fix the depression. It feels useless, but it's the best way to deal with a problem. Chuang-tzu idealizes the perfect man, who is in no way impacted by either admiration or hatred. He is egoless. The true or perfect man uses the knowledge he does have to discover the knowledge he doesn't have, but many times he must collect knowledge that appears useless and wait for a situation where it will become useful. Until then, it sits idle. The useless knowledge can often blend with other knowledge or create different points of view that even if the situation never arises, the knowledge still isn't useless if it allows you a different angle of looking at a problem and a different lens of seeing the world. The true, perfect, or primordial man has no regrets, made no show of power, and, if he was lucky, did not worry about the future. Part of his primordial man is true, but there are things about anthropology that Master Chuang could never have known. The hunter-gatherer man followed the weather, had little use for collecting things unless for a religious reason. The idea of planning ahead wasn't necessary until farming came into practice. They didn't really plan ahead because they had tribal lore that mostly told them what to do, how to follow the herds, when to migrate. They had more of a collective planning ahead than an individual one that came about through generations of trial and error. Their knowledge was encyclopedic as to what food was edible and in which season. However, ego and power are drugs even the primordial man had. But the tribes had a way to counter the worst of these things via leveling mechanisms. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this segment and think you would enjoy more of it, please consider buying a copy for yourself or a friend this holiday season. Link is listed below. If you have already purchased a copy, please consider leaving a review on Amazon, which will help the algorithm connect people who are looking for this type of information with my work. Thank you.